Hello friends, my name is Bintou and welcome back to my channel. So today's video is going to be all about audiobooks, and I love audiobooks. So usually what I'll do is when I read a book, I also check out the audiobook either through my library or I grab it on Audible with one of my credits. And I love reading the book along with the audiobook. And so over the course of listening to audiobooks, primarily over the past 2 years or so, there have been some audiobooks that have stood out because they were so very well done. And in this video, I want to talk about 5 either specific audiobooks or a group of audiobooks that I really enjoyed and recommend that you pick up. So let's jump into those audiobooks. So the very first one on my list, this is a category of sorts, and I would recommend an audiobook where it is a memoir and the author narrates the audiobook. I think that if you haven't listened to an author narrate their own autobiography or memoir through audio, then you're definitely missing out in hearing them deliver their story in their own words. I think there's something really awesome to that. And in this category, I actually have 3 recommendations. The first one is A Promised Land by Barack Obama. Audiobook for this is definitely really good because this book is long. And the audiobook, because you're listening to President Obama as he talks, and he obviously is a very skilled orator, it makes the time pass by much more pleasant. I know I personally love listening to his voice. I also feel like when he's talking about specific points in his journey, like for example, the death of his mom and grandmom and kind of him getting elected, you can sort of hear the emotion as he's talking. And I think that's really neat. Also, Born a Crime by Trevor Noah. This is also one of my favorite memoirs that I've ever read. And again, that audiobook is narrated by Trevor Noah. And because the book has a comedic edge to it, it's really cool to hear it in the voice of the comedian himself because his delivery is really quite good. And it definitely adds an extra dimension to the book rather than just reading it. That audiobook is fantastic. Besides, Trevor Noah has a really neat accent, and it's very enjoyable to listen to him tell his story in his accent. Language plays a really big role in his memoir, and it's pretty neat to hear him talk in these different languages that he knows. And last book in this category, I would say, is In the Dream House. This is a really tough memoir, and I think for that reason, it was really nice to hear it told from the author's voice. I can imagine that for this memoir in particular, it must be really difficult to read this story out loud. And the book already does a fantastic job of making you feel all the anxiety that the author feels as they're in this, it was a super abusive relationship. And her voice telling that story, her own story, I think adds an extra layer of dimension that even the words don't quite catch. So those are the 3 within my first recommendation of reading or listening to an audiobook memoir that was read by the author. My next recommendation is also sort of a category, but this is the Stormlight Archive books. So there are so far 4 books, Way of Kings, Words of Radiance, Oathbringer, and Rhythm of War. And all except for, actually no, at this point I have listened to all 4 of these on audiobook. And they're read all by the same 2 readers. I forget their names, but they are fantastic. And they just bring the characters in the Stormlight Archive to life. And because the Stormlight Archive books are already so grand in this world with all of these different characters, the audiobook really feels like a massive production. And this is just the audiobook. I've also listened to the graphic audio for one of the books within this series, and the audiobooks are good. The graphic audios take it to a whole other level. I mean, it's a whole movie at that point. But if you're considering reading the Stormlight Archives, I strongly encourage you to pick up the audiobook for at least one of them. And I can hear the voices of these characters in my head, even still when I think about them. Particularly if you've listened to the audiobook about Pattern, then you know what I'm talking about, Pattern's little buzz. I think that was just so well done, and it just adds so much character to the characters themselves. Next, while we're on the topic of fantasy-ish, I have really enjoyed a lot of the Stephen King audiobooks that I have listened to. None of them are narrated by King himself, but Some of my favorites, I just recently finished Needful Things, and I read the book and I also borrowed the audiobook from my library. Now, Needful Things is super neat because they actually play music within that audiobook, and it's really neat, particularly as chapters are like closing and opening. There's like this music that kind of sets the mood, and I think that's really awesome. I enjoyed that aspect of the audiobook. And I also really enjoyed the audiobook for The Stand because, again, there were a lot of different characters in that book, and I think that the audiobook did a fantastic job of providing a voice to each of these different characters. And certainly I feel like the characters that I ended up loving the most, for example, Tom, I don't know that I would have loved them to the point that I did if I didn't have that audio of them adding that extra dimension to their characters in the book. So those are so far my two favorite Stephen King audiobooks that I read. But in general, the audiobooks of the Stephen King books have all been pretty great, the ones that I have listened to. Number 4 on this list, I'm gonna go with The Night Swim by Megan Golden. So The Night Swim itself is a mystery thriller novel, and the book itself I think was good. The audiobook was excellent. And the reason being is that this book is a combination of a book, and there are like these podcast elements within the book, like alternating chapters are podcasts. And the audiobook did such a fantastic job of bringing those podcasts to life. There was a little bit of music involved, kind of like in Needful Things, like I just mentioned. So there was some music, and it felt like you were truly listening to a real true crime podcast. So I feel like them going the extra mile to bring that to real life, that really made me love this audiobook so much. And like I said, the book itself was good. I really enjoyed reading this book, but if you're planning to read it, definitely borrow that audiobook. And last but not least, we've talked about a memoir, some fantasy, and some horror and a mystery. Let's throw a romance in there. One of my most favorite romances that I enjoyed listening to was The Unhoneymooners by Christina Lauren. In fact, this is one that I pretty much listened entirely to on audiobook. And because The Unhoneymooners is like this haters to lovers, but also is like a romantic comedy, I think the audiobook just did such a good job of bringing the comedy aspect of it to life. Because I remember listening to this audiobook and just laughing out loud at some of the dialogue that was in it between the male and the female characters. And it's actually pretty short. I'm pretty sure I listened to the entire audiobook in one day. Overall, this was great. Again, mostly because the story itself was already really enjoyable. At least I thought it was. The audiobook bringing these fabulous and ridiculous characters to life was really awesome. It was a lot of fun. All right, guys, so those are the 5 audiobook recommendations that I have if you are someone that is really into audiobooks or looking to pick up some audiobooks. Definitely let me know what some of your favorite audiobooks have been if you are someone that does listen to audiobooks. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.